Good evening. Welcome to the Angry Capitalist Podcast. On this episode, I'm going to go over the periodic table of assets, column 2. This will be for fixed income. For anyone who's not super familiar with this series already, this is part 2 in the series. I will go ahead and at the end of the video, I'll have part 1 linked. If you have not already watched that, highly recommend going ahead and checking that out. Now, getting into it. Fixed income. Let me go ahead and pull up the next screen here. I'm playing around a little bit with the StreamYard features as well as the slides function. Super fun to get in. They've had a few updates, so I'm playing around with it a bit. So if I have to pause for a bit to go ahead and go back and tweak something, don't worry about it. Okay, so once again, this is covering the periodic table of asset classes. This goes over the various different types of assets, and it breaks them down in terms of liquidity, risk, as well as the specific class. That would be the column. So we've got currencies. That was in section 1 or video 1. And now we're on to the fixed incomes. Next slide here. I've gone ahead and isolated the fixed income column, and just because that's a little bit blurry for you to read to follow along with, I do have the various types of fixed incomes that we'll be discussing displayed there on the screen for you. So really briefly, what are fixed incomes? Effectively, what they are is their debt. So each one of these are effectively, if someone takes out a loan, this is the opposite side of that. So the loan is effectively one person's liability. Now, if you're the person who lent out that money, that loan is your asset. So that person will have to pay an amount of interest that is predetermined when the loan is taken out, that'll be repaid to the individual who lent that money out. Now, most commonly, the way to think about it when it comes to debt is various individuals, whether they be depositors or individuals who purchase bonds, they're effectively giving money to some kind of an institution, which will then go ahead and lend out that debt. So it's not exact to think of this in a 1-to-1 ratio where I took out a mortgage-backed security as an example, and my $30 bond is attached to Mr. Jones' property specifically. It's more of these things are formed in pools. So don't think about it as an exact bond being linked to an exact loan. That's typically not the case. However, with a few of these, that is in fact what will be happening. So first off, we have savings bonds. These are effectively a form of bond that is issued by a bank. The term that will be involved, so I'll go over a few pieces of terms, but a different kind of term. When I'm referring to term within this video, I'm talking about the term of maturity. So if I purchase this savings bond, right, and it's got a 3% yield on it. Now, when I say yield, that is the percentage that I'll be repaid for once that bond is paid off. So if I buy this $30 bond, that $30 goes to the bank. They then lend it out. And if I have a 3% interest rate or a 3% yield, once that bond matures, meaning that debt has been paid off, plus the interest, I can then liquidate that, or I'll then be paid out the principal, the amount that I bought the bond for, plus the interest rate. So the principal is I bought a $30 bond. My yield is, let's say, a 3% rate. So it'll be $30 plus 3%. And then the term is how long it takes for that bond to mature, meaning when I'll be paid back the principal plus the interest yield. So I hope that gives you a fairly down and dirty, quick explanation of what's going on here. If there's anything that I said that went a little bit past you, feel free to go ahead and drop it down in the comments below, or alternatively, just type the term into YouTube at the end of the video, and you can get more in-depth information on the specific terminology that's involved. But back into it. So first off, we've got savings bonds. Now, savings bonds, once again, this is a bond that a bank issues to effectively to help fund their lending operations. So this bank will issue bonds, and they have various maturity terms attached to them, and they have various yields. Now, these are moderately liquid. You can usually go ahead and liquidate them from the bank. Occasionally, there's some sort of fee associated with it if you try to sell the bond before it matures, or you just lose out on your yield. There can also be tax implications with each one of these, so make sure you look into that kind of thing before you purchase the bond in the first place. The worst thing that can happen, in my opinion, with these is you buy a specific financial product without understanding all of the ramifications about it. Further, this video should not be taken as specific investment advice nor financial advice. This is strictly for your educational purposes to give you a broader idea about this total asset class. None of this will be covering any specific financial instrument, and I'm not exactly endorsing any of these either. Okay, sorry, we've got that out of the way. So savings bonds, they have moderate liquidity. The risk level's 5 on this for the chart. Really, the biggest risk that I see with these is if the rate of inflation exceeds the yield during the term of the bond. So let's say I get a 10-year bond, right? And it takes 10 years for this bond to mature. And during that 10-year period, if the value of the bond, let's say it was $100, if the value of the currency that I put into that bond is inflated, meaning the value is destroyed by inflation, beyond what the yield, beyond what the return of that bond is going to be, then I'm basically losing money. Now, I may be losing money less slowly than having the dollar bill stuffed in a mattress or just sitting in a savings account, but there's still the risk that you could end up losing value with these savings bonds if you go into a period of high inflation or of hyperinflation. Next up, we have treasury bills. Now, these T-bills, these are specifically long-term treasury bills. So these are long-term government debt, specifically federal government debt. Excuse me. So if Uncle Sam needs to fund a bunch of Javelin missiles to go ahead and bomb some people somewhere, or they need to fund a bridge or fund people's salaries, one thing that they'll do is they'll issue these treasury bills. So it's packaged government debt. And they'll go ahead and issue these bills out. Usually these are then bought by the Federal Reserve, but they can also be bought by foreign countries, as well as you and I, either institutions or individuals can also buy these. But these are long-term bonds, effectively. Risk level on these is also 5. Once again, we have the risk of the inflation, the rate of inflation, exceeding the yield that you'll get from this piece of debt. And a quick note on this, looking back in history, the US government tends to, in fact, prefer to inflate the currency in such a way that it reduces their debt obligations. So that is definitely a risk factor to have in mind if you're considering this kind of an asset. Another risk factor that I see as a potential concern would also include valuation changes. As of time of recording, this is April 2024. Now, last June in 2023, we had a situation whereby banks were effectively coerced or forced to buy a whole bunch of treasury bills, right? And they bought them at a specific rate of return, a yield rate. And then the Federal Reserve started, for other reasons, to try and control the rate of felt inflation for consumers. They had started to increase interest rates to try and make the monetary policy more restrictive, trying to slow the economy down to thereby slow inflation down. Now, because they had purchased these bonds, and then the rate of return on other bonds that were currently being issued was higher, that caused the valuation of those older bonds with a lower rate of return to decrease. They created a liquidity crisis within the banking sector here in the US. So you have the concern that the rate of inflation can exceed the yield that you can get on this debt. And you also have the risk that, hey, you may buy this piece of debt, and if the interest rates going into the future increase, you may not be able to go ahead and turn around and sell that bond, even for the amount that you paid for it, to try and get the liquidity back. So once again, this is moderate liquidity for treasury bills. Next, we're going into municipal bonds. Now, these are effectively local governments. So think your town or your county. If they need to fund a bridge or fund new school buses, so on and so forth, they will often issue these municipal bonds to try and raise the funds in the immediate term to go ahead and then fund their project, often bought by local banking institutions, and can also be bought by either institutions or URI. Now, the risk level on these is 29. A few different risk factors here. Once again, we have the risk that the rate of inflation may exceed the yield on this debt. We do also have some concerns that with municipal bonds that they may default. Meaning, let's say, for example, we have the town of Springfield, and we all know the mayor in the town of Springfield is a crook who embezzles funds. It's possible that the municipality may default on this debt. So there's a little bit of a risk factor there. It's not super common, but it can happen. Once again, now with the treasury bills, we have the valuation change risk. The same thing applies here, and that trade value, or it may collapse or it may depreciate. If you took out a municipal bond at a 2% yield, a 2% rate of return, interest rates going into the future, halfway through your maturity, if the interest rates increase to 5-6%, well, you'll be pretty hard pressed to try and find someone who's willing to buy that bond that you've been holding on to. So you may be stuck holding on to it. Once again, with this, we have moderate liquidity. Next, we have corporate bonds. Now, corporate bonds and junk bonds, these are kind of linked. Really briefly, with corporate bonds, this is corporate debt with a decently rated risk to return profile. So there are various rating agencies that assign, like AAA plus, AAA minus, B rated, and I believe B minus and below would qualify as junk bonds. Effectively, it's just how risky the specific bond is. Now, with corporate bonds, we have a risk number of 37. Factors for risk include, once again, the rate of inflation exceeding yield. With corporate bonds, we have a little bit more of a concern that the corporation may, in fact, default. Right now, we have various companies which are going through bankruptcy. So if they go into bankruptcy court, they may either restructure that debt and still pay it off, or they may just charge it off. So think, for example, Kmart. When Kmart went under, various people were holding bonds issued from Kmart that defaulted. And so that corporate bond is no good. They're not going to pay you back. They're not going to pay you your yield. There's a little bit more risk with these. Likewise, once again, we still have the concern of the trade value collapsing or depreciating, and we still have moderate liquidity with these. Next up, we have what are called fixed annuities. So these are typically issued by insurance companies, and there is a quote-unquote guaranteed return that is backed by an insurance company who invests the money deposited. Now, these have a fixed rate of return, so they still fall underneath fixed income. Effectively, it's still a form of debt, technically speaking. There's a lot of nuance that goes into fixed annuities, and there's quite a bit of variance. As an example, this is not rated when it comes to the risk profile. Some of the reasons being is with fixed annuities, there's usually fees associated. And you can have varying fee structures, some of which are very favorable, some of which it borderline looks like a toxic asset, or it is a toxic asset. Further, it is a guaranteed, quote-unquote, return that is backed by an insurance company. But if that insurance company goes completely insolvent, there are still risks. I don't like to think or describe anything as being truly guaranteed. So if there's a problem with that fixed annuity, if the insurance company goes bust, there may be problems there with you getting paid back, but it is quote-unquote guaranteed. Yeah. Now, there is varying fee structures with these once again. There's also very low flexibility. You undoubtedly have heard of J.G. Wentworth, 877 cash now. If you have a structured annuity and you need cash now, that's whereby with a fixed annuity, they're typically used by retirees to have a guaranteed return and a guaranteed payout over time. Now, if you have that fixed annuity, it is typically locked in, very difficult to get out of it. Some companies, some firms such as J.G. Wentworth will purchase your annuity and pay you cash, a cash settlement for it. There's fairly low flexibility and also low liquidity with these. Not a whole lot of people or firms out there will buy annuities, and typically it's not going to be in a very favorable position for the individual who purchased the annuity and is trying to exit that position and get the cash out. There's also the issue with fees. In my opinion, if you're going to consider something like an annuity, this is really where you need a financial advisor to assist you. to make sure that you don't get fucked over. And also, if something was not properly explained, you've got someone you can hopefully point the fingers at and have some kind of recourse against. So be careful with these. Highly recommend talking to a licensed financial advisor if you're going to consider a fixed annuity. And also, once again, low liquidity. Next, we're on to junk bonds. So these are high yielding, meaning they typically have a much higher rate of return, but they're also much more speculative in terms of the person issuing it. So typically, junk bonds are a form of commercial or corporate debt. However, their risk to return profile means that they're not very well rated. They typically, because there's more risk, they have to pay out a higher rate of interest. So these can be quite lucrative, but they're very risky. Definitely not for the faint of heart. I believe it was, I forget the individual's exact name, but back in the early to mid 2000s, there was the junk bond king. Once the video is done, if you go ahead and just look that up on YouTube, you can find out more information about how that worked. Now, in full disclosure, if I remember correctly, the junk bond king was making quite a bit of money with junk bonds. However, once again, there's a very significant risk factor there. And these, perhaps, this is also something where if you're going to consider them, do your own due diligence, perhaps talk with a licensed financial advisor, and buyer beware. So risk level's 57. Right off the bat, we have a much higher risk of default. There is also a much higher risk that the trade value of these bonds may in fact collapse, and they also can be difficult to trade or to liquidate if need be. Not so much that they're tied up as much as other fixed income assets can be, such as fixed annuities. It's just that, once again, you've got to have the right buyer for something like a junk bond. So it may be difficult to exit a position if you buy these. And for that reason, these are rated with a low liquidity. Quite frequently, if you purchase a junk bond and if it's uncovered that that is in fact a toxic asset, meaning that there is a very high likelihood that the person who had taken out that debt is going to go ahead and default, it could be very hard to liquidate that. Going back into what I had discussed at the beginning of the video. So with many of these, it's more of a tranche of debt or a giant pool of debt, and then either an insurance company or a bank or the Treasury Department is issuing out these bonds, little slices of the debt, but it's not exactly connected to anything one-to-one. With corporate bonds, as well as junk bonds, municipal bonds as well, these can be tied to a specific, to a more specific loan package or to a more specific entity. So, for example, municipal bonds can often be tied to your local township or to your county government. There's a more direct connection there. Likewise, this is something super cool that I'm currently doing research on. Some corporate raiders, these are individuals who use financial instruments in very aggressive and atypical manners, have in fact used bonds to seize assets through like a bankruptcy recourse. So a little bit about that. Let's say a company, Acme Co., issues a bunch of debt, right? and it is Acme Co. is listed on the bond, that they're the one who had issued this bond and that it's backed by them, by that company. Now, let's say they go through default. If an individual entity, a person or a company, possesses enough of those bonds, or they manage to amass enough people or other institutions that also own those bonds, they could potentially go after the assets if that debt was secured to be made good and whole. I believe Carl Icahn had actually did that against a small government in Latin America. I don't remember the exact company or a country, and he had seized the country's ships, making it so that they couldn't leave port because they defaulted on these bonds, and he was going to get his. So there are some interesting ways that those can be used. I highly recommend you do a little bit more digging and research on it. That's something that I'm currently doing myself. So oftentimes people will look at the fixed income asset class as very boring, or, oh, that's for old people, it's for old fuddies. You're effectively becoming the bank, is the way I like to think about it. You hold someone's debt. They fucking owe you. This is kind of like being a legal loan shark, if you will. If done properly with the right debt instrument and the right forms of recourse, it can be a little bit of like the Wild West. Very, very common for institutions in Europe, particularly in the UK. Here in the US, we tend to have more of a stock-minded financial sector as opposed to the bond market. But no, these can be pretty fun, pretty exciting, and potentially a very lucrative asset, especially so if you're more of the type of individual who wants to have more of a predictable rate of return that's really based on fundamentals. So with the bond market, largely speaking, it's straight up math. You've got your principal, the amount that you pay for those bonds. Let's say $1,000, $5,000, etc. And you've got your yield, your rate of return, plus your term. So, you bought $1,000 worth of corporate bonds with a 7% rate of return over 2 years, 3 years, I don't know. And so you wait for that time period, and then you get paid back the principal plus the interest. These can be very lucrative, and really, I think they deserve more attention. So, if you've enjoyed this video, and if you have any further questions when it comes to the fixed income asset class, please go ahead and drop those down in the comments below. I may use those comments as some ideas for my next video if you want me to go ahead and do a deep dive in some of these segments. Further, if you're someone that invests in this asset class, do you have any stories in regards to that? Have you ever been burned by purchasing junk bonds or corporate bonds? I'd love to hear about it. Likewise, do you have any absolutely phenomenal success stories where you bought a specific class of bond and you got an awesome yield out of it? Please go ahead and drop those down in the comments below. Likewise, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you get notifications when I upload further videos like this. Till the next time, take care and keep it classy.